Thank you so much, and it's such a great pleasure to be here. I've heard a lot about this wonderful school from Karen Wilkin over the years, and so nice to actually set foot in the premises. I've never been here before, so it's a very great treat. I am going to talk to you tonight about this man, Jan Lievens, and a lot of what I am going to try to share is very recent for me. It was because we did this exhibition in last year, and it was a fabulous learning experience. Jan Lievens, so far as I knew, worked for 3 years. Which turns out not to be the case. But when I was in graduate school, the little bit we heard about Jan Lievens was that he was born in 1607. We didn't learn that, but he was born in 1607. But where it becomes interesting is that Rembrandt was born in the same city in 1606. And so these two artists grew up together. And for a very short period, of 3 years, in the late 1630s, they came very close together in the way they worked. And the story of Jan Lievens, that if it's ever told, is only told in regard to Rembrandt. And it's always a comparison is, well, is it as good as Rembrandt? Basically, that's how it's told. Well, I had a student at Maryland who did his dissertation, Lloyd DeWitt, on Jan Lievens, and so Lloyd, over the years, forced me to deal with Jan Lievens in lots of ways that I hadn't done before. And out of that experience, we decided that doing an exhibition on this artist would be really interesting. And in fact, it was an incredible learning experience. I will never look at Dutch art again like I thought I knew it. It has pushed me in new ways in so many directions. Now, unfortunately, for New Yorkers, Jan Lievens is particularly an unknown quantity because there are no Jan Lievens paintings in New York public collections. So it's surprising in this great city and this great collections that you have that artist never quite made it into the Met or the Frick or one of these other places. But he is to be seen in America, and at the Getty, at the National Gallery, in Philadelphia, and various places. I'll try to bring some of those paintings into the story, and hopefully they will, you'll find some connection over the years with him after having seen a little bit of this story tonight. But the best way for me to tell the story, I think, is in a way sort of a fairy tale. And I hope you will, say a little bit different approach to art history tonight, but it strikes me that the way I really came to know Jan Lievens was at the time of the exhibition, and you may remember that last fall in this country we had an election. And everywhere you went, you heard the cry for change. It's time for change. Whether it was the cornfields of Iowa, the mountains of New Hampshire, the shores of Lake Michigan, or the banks of the Potomac River, the cry for change was everywhere. Everywhere. It actually crossed over the ocean in Europe, and this happened in Europe all the way as well. But what people don't realize is it went back in time, way back to the 17th century, even touched a young artist who grew up in Leiden, and he said, it's time for change. I am sick to death of being forgotten. And so one day, when I was walking through the galleries, and there was these closed galleries, I heard these noises behind the doors, and what the hell is that? So I walked in there, and there was this guy this light shining up at him, this kind of weird, spooky, kind of ethereal quality. And he looked at me and he said, I have decided to do something about this problem. It is time for change. And so, to do this, this man, Jan Lievens, had gone around, unbeknownst to most museums and private collectors, taken their works from all around the world and brought them together. Said, it's time for me to tell the story. It's time for me to show the capital of the United States what I was as an artist. It's time to me to go to the heartland of America and have an exhibition in Milwaukee. And even more important, it's time for me to take this exhibition to Amsterdam and to move out all those Rembrandts from the Rembrandt house and have the exhibition there. And I will have my poster on the outside of the Rembrandt house showing finally that I am every bit as worthy as that man, and taught him a lot more than anybody could ever have imagined. And so this story tonight is my tour of that exhibition that Jan Lievens brought together, and the stories that he had to tell. And it's fascinating because there were some of these things that you say, oh my God, how did this happen? You know, he was particularly annoyed that this painting, Sultan Suleiman, so famous in his day, because it was painted by Lievens for the court in The Hague before the court had ever heard about this guy Rembrandt. They had come to Lievens and said, we want this huge, and it's about the size of what you see on the screen, this big painting, powerful painting of this traveler from the far who had come to the court. I mean, this kind of thing that they dressed up, and they were excited by this, and they actually had people at the court who dressed like these people from the Far East, from the Near East. Sultan Suleiman, and actually this guy, Rembrandt, got so inspired by this, he painted, and there is even a noble Slav at the Met based on this painting. I mean, he couldn't stand seeing what I did, and he had to compete with me all the time. You know how it is. But you know the thing that drives me really crazy, Wheelock, he said to me, when you were a student, a graduate student, and you had your beloved Professor Seymour Slive teach you about Rembrandt, this was the first Rembrandt you ever learned. The Feast of Esther, my great early masterpiece. My great early masterpiece, you were taught, was Rembrandt's earliest painting. Here I am showing the power of this moment with Esther, who has called together her husband Ahasuerus because she has learned that the wicked counselor Haman, and guess which one is Haman? Haman's there on the left. The wicked counselor Haman has betrayed the Jews and is going to destroy, to kill all the Jews. And so, unbeknownst to Haman, she has chosen this moment of this feast to reveal the treachery to her husband, the king. And Haman, thrilled, getting all dressed up in his fanciest clothes because he has a big night out with the king, realizes suddenly, this is not where I want to be. You know, and you see the king, his eyes bulging, and Lievens says to me, you know, every time you want to see somebody mad in my paintings, look at their eyes. Their eyes are always bulging, you know. And then painting these thick paint, this real thick paints. I love to paint thick paints, he said. The way the fists are clenched. You see the anger and how the light and dark throwing back Haman. I mean, you know exactly what's going on when you look at this painting. That painting, this is my early masterpiece, you were taught was Rembrandt. And you know what's happened? Not only have my great paintings been called Rembrandt over the years, but when the Dutch art historians decide to do an exhibition on the history of Dutch portraiture, they don't include me. Never was I included in the History of Dutch Portraiture show. But look at these portraits, this young, elegant prince, or this old, crotchety Dutch guy. I mean, I could paint the roughness of the flesh tones or the wrinkles, or I could paint the smoothness and the elegance to rival Van Dyck. I could paint landscapes of the type that you wouldn't see for 200 years. You wouldn't see into the Barbizon artists. Did they include me in the history of Dutch landscape? No, not included. I mean, he's really getting pissed. I mean, you can see, this starts to work. Look, exactly. So he takes me over to this painting. He said, genre paintings, history of Dutch genre paintings. This is, I mean, there's nothing. Here's the eyes bulging again. You can see, but this death, the skeleton coming out, attack these gamblers, showing the transience of life and all the activities. Do they include me in a genre scene, genre paintings? No. It's not fair. So that's why I had to do this. And what's even worse is that when and what I mentioned to you before, I had been taught Lievens only worked for 3 years. Well, it turns out that not only did he have a long career and keep painting and painting and painting until the 1670s, so from the 1620s to the 1670s, 50 years, but for the last 20, 30 years, he is back in Amsterdam, at the same city where Rembrandt is working, painting for major commissions of the type that Rembrandt wanted and couldn't get. He painted for the Amsterdam Town Hall, for example. A large painting. This is an oil sketch that was in the exhibition of the history of the Batavians, who were the rulers, the early historic prototypes for the Dutch. It's a long story, I'm not going to get into it. But anyhow, Rembrandt was asked, in fact, to paint for this interior series of paintings by different artists. Rembrandt's paintings got rejected. Lievens' painting is still there. And yet, you have never heard that I painted for the town hall. So anyway, this was the motivation. And so, with that, we walked through the show a little bit. And he wanted to stop at this painting that's in Philadelphia. And I mentioned this Philadelphia, of this old woman reading a book. Powerful in its expressive qualities, as she holds that book, Bible obviously, before her, with this incredibly rich ermine cloak over her shoulders. Thick paint. The thickness and application of paint in the early Lievens is unbelievable. I mean, the way the wrinkles on her forehead and the boldness of the accents of color all through this painting, the transparency of the glasses, all that quality. He said, "Do you know when I painted that?" I said, "Well, I read maybe." And he said, "Yes, that's the one. I painted that when I was 14 years old." I painted that when I was 14 years old. That's my grandmother. And in that book about Leiden that you read, Jan Orler's, a historian of Leiden, he talks about how much of a child prodigy I was. In fact, my parents sent me off in let me just, okay. My parents sent me off when I was 10 years old, from Leiden to Amsterdam to study with this artist by the name of Peter Lassman. Peter Lassman was the most famous history painter of his day. I stayed there for 2 years. So in the mid-teens, so I was born in 1607, I was there 16, 17, 18. I was back in Leiden working as an artist on my own. And by 1621, I painted that painting of my grandmother. And Orlis talks about how the people in Leiden couldn't believe what they were seeing by this artist. And how not only the people in Leiden, but the princes. So this is where we know that Sultan Suleiman was painted for the Prince of Orange. his reputation spreads quickly. But what's interesting, if you look at this painting by Peter Lassman, it is the same story. It is the Feast of Esther. It is Ahasuerus leaping up from the table, Haman pleading for mercy as Esther pulls back. And if you look at what I did, notice how different my painting is from what Peter Lassman had done. How on earth, I said, did you do that? How did you go from there to there? You have these small painting about so big by Lassman, you have full-length figures. Feast of Esther is, no, it's big, you know, it's big, anyhow. It's as wide as one of those dividers there. It's a big life-size figures, totally different. Well, what Lievens said was, you know, there was a time at that moment when I had heard that in Utrecht there was all sorts of excitement, because in Utrecht there were a group of artists who had been in Italy and had come back in 1620. There was Hendrik Baburen, Dirk van Baburen and Honthorst and Terbruggen were all these artists in Utrecht who had come back, who had discovered what Caravaggio had been doing in Rome and had brought that story back to the Netherlands. And I went there to see what was going on, because in their works they focused paintings around a table. They did half-length figures. They did the moment of drama with light and dark. All these things I learned from these artists. And I did it at a time, this painting, 1625, before this guy Rembrandt even starts to paint. Rembrandt, in fact, goes to study with Peter Lassman in 1625 as a student, comes back in 1626. Uh-oh, I went one too far there. Let's see if that can come. Okay, he comes back, 1626, paints this story, this painting, which we don't know the subject of, it's in Leiden, but that is a painting painted the year after Lievens paints the Feast of Esther. Now I ask you, what painting, if you had a choice between these two paintings, which one would you choose? I mean, this guy, Rembrandt, is a pretty clumsy artist at this point in his career. I mean, there's no comparison with these two works. Absolutely no comparison. We won't go into it any further, but anyhow, that's... But he paints also in that same year this wonderful painting of Pilate washing his hands. And you have this young person leaning over, washing the hand, the water splashing off Pilate's hands. And what's interesting, Pilate looks directly out at you, because that choice, who are we crucifying, is made by you and your descendants. And he makes you aware of that. There's no getting away from the gaze of Pilate at you. This is something that Lievens, with the thickness of paint, also in his way he composes his figures, brings those elements together. This composition, though, is one he based on one of these Utrecht artists. This is a Terbruggen painting of the same subject, a Pilate washing his hands. But look at what Lievens does. He gives it a physicality, a weight, a heaviness, a sort of presence that is reinforced by the power of that gaze coming out at you. It's a really powerful painting to stand in front of and feel that. The connections to Utrecht are many in these works, and in this particular work you have the connection with a compositional type from Terbruggen. This is another artist in Utrecht whose name is Abraham Bloemaert, and notice that this is the adoration of the Magi, and there's the cope worn by the major figure leaning over the Christ child, and it's the same cope that Pilate is wearing. And this was one that we know was in Utrecht. So further evidence that he was there in those years. Now what's interesting And this is something that I didn't pick up until he let me know in the case. All these, who are these models? This is an interesting question. I mean, he's posing these figures. And he said, I needed to have friends that I could use as models. And this guy on the right, who's pouring the water, is actually my buddy Rembrandt. And you'll see Rembrandt appearing in a lot of these early Lievens paintings. Young Rembrandt, before he really gets going. The painting on the right, I'll get back to a bit later, is a painting by Lievens of Rembrandt. And so you can start to see figure characteristics of these. And you can see the same model coming back over and over again in Lievens' painting. His young friend who's starting to learn how to paint, being taught in many ways by Jan Lievens. Jan Lievens is so far advanced of Rembrandt in the mid-20s. Rembrandt doesn't begin to really paint until 26, 27, 28. And what's interesting, historically, Lievens' paintings have been dated after that time because it was always seen that Lievens was a follower of Rembrandt. The idea that Lievens actually was doing things before Rembrandt had started just was never part of the way one calculated this relationship. So it's really been fascinating to see all this evolve. Well, Lievens explained that his big break actually came when he was visited by this gentleman on the right, whose name is Constantine Hawkins. And Constantine Hawkins is a fascinating, one of the most important people in the Dutch Republic in the early years of the 17th century. He was the secretary to the Prince of Orange, which doesn't give credit for it. He sort of took care of the Prince of Orange's affairs in every possible way. This is the Prince of Orange. This is Frederick Hendrik, who was leading the Dutch revolt against Spanish aggression. But he was also a poet, a playwright, an architect, and an art lover. And one of the things Hawkins wanted was that the court in The Hague be as important, artistically at least, as other courts in Europe. And to this end, he invited all sorts of artists to come to The Hague to work. And as far as Hawkins was concerned, as far as Frederick Hendrik was concerned, the Netherlands was north and south. So today we think of Holland as this northern, what was the northern provinces, and Belgium as the southern provinces. That resulted from the revolt. But during that time, even though it was pretty much separated, they still saw it as an entire thing. So Hawkins wanted Rubens to come work at the court. That didn't really happen, but he wanted then Van Dyck, Anthony Van Dyck, the great portrait painter in Antwerp. And sure enough, Van Dyck did come to The Hague. In the late 1620s, early 1630s, Van Dyck comes, and in fact, that painting is by Van Dyck. That portrait of the Prince of Orange is by Van Dyck, and it's in Baltimore Museum of Art. So it's one of these great things we don't think about, Van Dyck working in The Hague. My God, who would have thought? And you know, when he's there, Van Dyck is doing portraits of other people, artists of all type, collectors, whatever. He does a portrait of, guess who? Jan Lievens. Guess who he does not do a portrait of? Remember, you got it. Very interesting. So he comes, Hawkins, in search of young artists who can come to work at the court of Frederick Hendrik. He's heard about these young whippersnappers in Leiden. So one day he gets in his little carriage and he goes off to Leiden, and he goes to meet Jan Lievens. And he writes this wonderful description of Jan Lievens as a person and as an artist, and says, Lievens paints these big, bold paintings, like the Feast of Esther, or Pilate. Big, bold paintings, powerful, expressive in every dimension. Rembrandt paints small, very expressive paintings, very different in type. But where Lievens really wreaks miracles, and this is the word he uses, miracles, is with the human face. And Lievens hears that and says, huh. And so he cannot sleep. at night. And next morning, before he even wakes, Hawkins hears a knock on his door. Mr. Hawkins, Mr. Hawkins, I could not sleep. I need to paint your portrait. And so this is the portrait that Lievens paints of Hawkins in those years. It is a very fascinating portrait because he is gazing off in this very sort of unfocused way. It seems rather stiff, but Hawkins loved this portrait. He showed it off all the time because he said, in those years I was troubled. In those days, in those months, I was troubled. There were things on my mind, and Lievens captured that quality of thoughtfulness, of my sort of being off in some other zone. It was really interesting. But it was with this interest in the face that you start to see all sorts of head studies. Tronie, we call this, the Dutch term tronie. This young self-portrait. This is how Lievens looked when Hawkins arrived that fateful day. Young, sort of proto-Chopin. I mean, it's hard to imagine this is 17th century, not looking at you, looking off to the future, as it were, this dramatic light coming across. Wonderful, free, fresh study. Very much in the mode of Van Dyck, in fact. He knows what Van Dyck is doing in heads. He sort of has a Van Dyck. In fact, this painting is now on loan at the National Gallery, and we're hanging it next to a Van Dyck head of exactly the same age, youth. It's very fascinating to see them side by side. Another head study. You've already met him, Rembrandt. This is Lievens. This is Rembrandt. Same time. Rembrandt. This pudgy little Dutch guy. It's sort of interesting if you think of Rembrandt's self-portraits in those years, how Rembrandt shows a very dramatic, chiaroscuro, light, dark drama. Well, that's not what Lievens sees at all. I mean, this is a true testament of friendship. You know, this might put him down as much as you can. But anyhow, it's a wonderful portrait, but it is very interesting how different the perception of Rembrandt is from Lievens' brush than it is from Rembrandt's brush, and how different, in fact, Rembrandt's perception of Lievens is from Lievens', you know, it's very, very interesting to see these portraits and sense of who these people are and what they see of themselves. The whole psychological side of it is really fascinating. One reason that Rembrandt and Lievens both were admired by Hawkins was because he wanted people to court, and that's one reason Lievens jumped up in the middle of the night to go paint Hawkins' portrait, because he knew that was where he could access the court. They wanted to be court painters. It was clear they wanted to be court painters. This was more successful for Lievens than it was for Rembrandt initially. Later on, Rembrandt does paint a lot for the court, but it's initially much more Lievens whose work is desired. Now, now we're in the late 1620s, so they have come together. They've both come back from studying with Lassman. They are both in Leiden, a small little place. Rembrandt and Lievens, in fact, become very, very similar in their works. They both like tronie. They both study old people. They share the same model. That's a Rembrandt on the right. That's a Lievens on the left. It's the same old woman that's often called Rembrandt's mother, and everything it was never called Lievens' mother. It's always been called Rembrandt's mother, but it could as well be Lievens' mother or grandmother, whatever. But it's always been a Rembrandt world, so we've seen it through Rembrandt's eyes. But they both do this interest in age, old age, fascinating. These young artists stretching themselves, studying old age. This is a painting that just was recently given to the gallery. It's a wonderful study, a tronie, again, a head study. It's not a portrait. None of these are portraits. They are expressive studies of character studies. Eyes looking out, gazing out, having the kind of reflective quality, sort of trying to get the physical characteristics of the person there for us to see, to feel, to feel how the tactile quality of the paint, the kind of all these things that he was doing earlier, but now a little bit more subtle and restrained. A lot of what's very interesting, what we used to call a Rembrandt technique, and that is scratching of the blunt end of the brush into the paint. So that whole beard is all the lighter lines are made by scratching into the wet paint. This is something he's doing way before Rembrandt starts doing it. But it is this interest in the psychology of age, the wisdom of age, the foolishness of age, the kind of experiences that one has, all sides of age come into play there. It's really interesting in terms of young artists doing that. And these studies, like this Trony, this old man, then become the kind of studies that they do when they do big paintings. This is a huge painting. It's in Ottawa. It's a Job on the Dung Hill. It is Lievens' great masterpiece. In fact, it is one of the most extraordinary paintings of the 17th century, of age, of the kind of the sinews of the body, the kind of saggy muscles, the kind of wasted soul. It is an incredible painting. If you come up close and see the brushwork and the whole expressiveness, and then you have Job's wife in the background telling him, "Give it up, Job. We've gone through enough problems because of your faith, and just give it up." And Job was not about to lose his faith, leave it behind. And he sits there in this incredible agony of his being. It's all interesting. This is a painting that I would have loved to put as a poster for this exhibition, but you couldn't do it. You can understand why. I mean, it's not something that would bring people in, but it is really one of these amazing paintings. It makes you wonder. It makes you realize the intensity of faith of these people. Who would have a painting like this in their living room? But somebody did. It was painted for a private home. So the whole question of who is Lievens painting for? Who is Rembrandt? Who are these works for? What is the relationship of them and their religion? They're both at this point raised Protestants, but they have connections on all sides of religious. They're very aware of Jewish traditions, of Catholic traditions, and it's a very universal kind of way of seeing. But it has the stories, the kind of human stories, the human dimensions of these stories that are what at the core of what they do. That is true of the painting, and Lievens, like Rembrandt, is a great etcher. And I'm not showing you nearly as many drawings and prints as I would like to, but incredibly rich prints. This is St. Jerome, but it's basically the same figure as Job. But the whole dry point, the etching, the cutting of plates down, making smaller of different states, all the issues that we know of Rembrandt exist with Lievens. And it's an amazing array of genre scenes, of portraits, of landscapes, everything. We'll see a little bit later. I just want to spend a moment on this painting, which is, or two paintings here, which is quite interesting. They are two paintings of the raising of Lazarus. The one on the right is by Rembrandt, the one on the left is by Lievens. There are instances, quite a few instances, not just Trony of the same figures, but also of artists, the two artists painting the same subjects. It's almost like Hawkins has set up a competition. I want to see what you guys do with the raising of Lazarus. And so each of you go home and come up with whatever. And so you feel that there is some competition to kind of pushing each other in these years. It's really fascinating. But it's also interesting to see the different personalities. Rembrandt is a very, I see the relationship somewhat comparable to the relationship of Rubens and Van Dyck. Rubens is very physical and powerful and expressive and muscular, and Van Dyck is more spiritual and more restrained. Same thing you could say with Rembrandt and Lievens. So you have with Rembrandt's version of the raising of Lazarus, you have Christ standing there with his arm raised up like a magician, and by the power of his forceful gesture, you see Lazarus there in the tomb below, kind of rising up, coming out of the tomb. And it's a very physical way of expressing this miracle from the Bible. With Lievens, it's an entirely different story. In fact, Christ is not at all raising up or making Lazarus come up, rise from the dead. No, he has his arms quietly, linked in front of him, and he is looking up to God. Because from God comes the power to bring life back to the dead Lazarus. So it's a very quiet composition with a strong horizontal, strong vertical, with a kind of sweep of the cloth rising up for the excitement and the amazement of the figures around the side that you have in both paintings. But it is the religious story, the message, the sort of the spiritual, the thinking, the gazing. Remember Hawkins, the gazing. Lievens does a lot with the gaze and the quietude and the sort of reflective quality of portraits and biblical stories and all across. Well, it's a very different personality, and the personality starts to play a role. You can see this personality difference also in a very wonderful double portrait at the Getty. This is a painting that goes back to Hawkins's efforts to bring Lievens and Rembrandt into the court culture. There were in fact two courts in The Hague, one the Prince of Orange and the other the sister of the King of England, Elizabeth, and her husband, who had been Protestant rulers in the Palatinate for a winter, and then they got kicked out. So they're called the Winter King and Winter Queen. And so they went on to find some safe haven. They went to The Hague, where there was another Protestant court, and they were there outside the court. And Hawkins was able to get commissions for Lievens from this other family. And this is a portrait of the son, one of the sons, and his tutor, an older man who's explaining the Bible, or explaining the text, this huge tome that is there, and the gaze of the young boy as he learns the lessons from his old master. It's interesting, old age, young, a lot of contrast of age in his paintings, but it's this quietude of the story and the way they link together, done very much in the thinking of Van Dyck, having been the court, the kind of elegance of a Van Dyck kind of mode. This is what the court really liked. Court was really like the Flemish international style. Van Dyck, as an artist, was very important for understanding what the court admired with his art. Now, the fact that he is in Leiden and The Hague working for the court was wonderful for Lievens, but he thought bigger. Just like that self-portrait that shows him gazing off in the future, he wanted bigger and better things, exploring the world out there beyond the Netherlands. And so at a certain moment, in 1631, he decides that, wow, it's interesting enough to be there in this court. There's a lot bigger court that I'd like to go to, and that's London. So probably with a recommendation of this young man's mother, Elizabeth, who was the sister of the King of England, Charles I, then Lievens goes to London to be a court painter for the King of England in 1631. It was a great decision. It would have been a great decision. Let's put it that way. It would have been a great decision, and I must say, Lievens didn't really want to talk about this when we were having a little chat. But unfortunately, Van Dyck decided 4 months later that he wanted to go to England to be court painter. And so that happened, and Lievens now becomes kind of an assistant to Van Dyck for about 3 years. We know he paints the king, we know he does all, there's nothing really left of those London years. It's really interesting. The story kind of gets split there in the middle between the Leiden period and the rest of his career. But at a certain point, he decides, this has been great, I like to do these portraits, but I've had a world of doing genre scenes and all sorts of other stuff, history paintings. I want to do that, and I'm not allowed to do that in England. So he decides to go to Van Dyck's own city, Antwerp, in 1634. He goes to Antwerp, and then he meets up with a rowdy group of artists. And you may know this painting because it's in the Met. This is an Adrian Brouwer self-portrait, looking out at you with his puffing, the smoke coming out of his mouth. Wonderful. And at his dinner party are some of his other artist friends. And over on the right is Jan Davis de Heem, who was a still life painter. And then the guy right between Brouwer and his pipe is actually Jan Lievens. So he is there in the middle of this group of artists, and he was having a great time, sort of being finally back in a kind of a world that he felt comfortable with in his Leiden period. And in fact, in those years, he does these genre paintings, the one we looked at before. There's a couple of the genre paintings, very much in the style of Adrian Brouwer. In fact, this painting was painted in 1638, which is the very year that Brouwer died. There was a plague that went through Antwerp. Brouwer dies very young, very tragically, and I'm sure that this painting was painted, death coming unexpectedly, very much like had happened with all these people in Antwerp in 1638, and probably in homage to Brouwer. So to see this, it was a very well-regarded painting. Sorry, I went too fast here again. Oops. And there was a print, Brouwer, Lievens made a print after it, which was circulated, a lot of reproductive prints in Antwerp, and so Lievens gets involved in prints after some of his paintings. This is one of those works. Now, in Antwerp, he does all sorts of things, and one of the things that he really begins, and this is where you start to see him constantly pushing the envelope, becoming a different artist. And this is one reason that's been so hard to follow his career, because he does things suddenly they appear, and they have these extraordinary landscapes, these pen and wash drawings, beautiful kind of characterization of this polled tree and the kind of branches and the leaves, and the sort of very much in the Van Dyck mode. On the right is something else he does, which is unique to any Dutch artist, and that's woodcuts. He is the only artist to make woodcuts, painter, printmaker. And this, in fact, in the whole history of art, is the only landscape without figures. This is amazing. There are only 2 impressions of this still in existence, but it's a very beautiful, very rare thing. We're very fortunate to have it in the exhibition. So these 2 examples of focus drawing on a tree, the woodcut landscape, a lot of beautiful landscapes that he does, woodland views. There in the middle of this drawing is an artist sitting in the middle of the trees, the drawing from nature. This is something that Lievens must have done. These very long parallel hatchings in the lines, very, very atmospheric landscapes. Now these were done in Antwerp, but he goes back to Amsterdam, as I mentioned, in the 1640s, and he continues to do landscapes throughout his life. And this, to me, was really interesting to see, okay, where do these fit? How much impact, how much influence did his landscapes, drawings, have with other Dutch artists? And quite a bit, in fact. He's very, very well regarded. A lot of beautiful drawings, and there is a beautiful drawing of this nature at the Met, in fact, in the drawing department there. And there are a number of beautiful Lievens drawings at the Pierpont Morgan, too. But this is, to me, really very interesting, because he marries a Catholic at this time. So he changes from Protestant to Catholic while he's in Antwerp. And he really wants to do more than he was able to do in London, as mentioned. And one of the things he wants to do is religious paintings. And he does this very beautiful lamentation of the dead Christ and the Virgin and John and Joseph Arimathea on the right, Mary Magdalene, very much in the Van Dyck manner. And this is, so he's in this painting, in fact, So I thought I had another slide here. What happened? Yeah, very much in the Van Dyck. This is a Van Dyck painting. You can see how close in character Lievens has changed. His style has changed. This more the very smooth body of the Christ, the sort of elongated composition. This was, in fact, used to be called Van Dyck. So we not only have Lievens being called Rembrandt, but he's being called lots of different artists over the years. And that's one reason his career is so hard to characterize, because it changes so much over time. This is very interesting that this painting is unique, as far as I know, in the story, the way the story is told, because the Virgin is holding the crown of thorns that she's passing to Joseph Arthur, and he holds this big platter out there, and she's putting the crown of thorns in the platter. I've never seen this motif ever in another painting. My guess is that it was painted for a church with a relic of one of the thorns or something like that, that probably was painted of that nature. It's interesting to go back to Job and see just a few years. So this is 1631, the Job painting. The Lamentation is 1638, so it's 7 years. But what a world of difference in terms of handling of the body. You probably can't tell from these images, but if you get next to these paintings and see the smooth refinement of the body of Christ on the left, and the wrinkly impastos that he used for Job, it's like an entirely different artist. And this willingness to push himself to new styles, new dimensions, is really an incredible thing. This is, I find it quite compelling part of his story. Sometimes it's seen as a weakness because he changes. There's no, what is a Jan Lievens style? So this is part of the debate about him as an artist. Is there a core element of Lievens that remains as he progresses in styles over the years? I think there is, and it's part of the physicality of these figures that remains all the way through, but that is a debate. And this is an interesting, it's not an easy artist. There's no easy things about him that we always have to kind of play off and understand him in terms of our own perceptions of the story prior to learning about Lievens and during learning about Lievens and reflecting upon Lievens. It's very interesting. I find it a very challenging world. I just want to show you another aspect of his art, because he becomes a very, very prominent printmaker, portrait prints. This on the left is a Van Dyck print of the type that he was making in the 20s and 30s, in The Hague as well, of artists and collectors. That is a print by Lievens on the right. You can see how close it is in character to the Van Dyck in terms of the framing, the hand coming over the edge of the frame, the text below, the sort of gestures. This is a very important theologian, and this is sort of more of an aristocrat on the left, so they have different clothing, but the characterization is the same. But what I find interesting in Lievens' portraits, in the prints, but also in the drawings, is yet again how varied his techniques can be. This man on the left is a very important, the burgomaster of Amsterdam. Very powerful figure in the whole Dutch story of Amsterdam and his great golden years. And there he is in this wonderful soft velvety quality, the rendering of his clothes, and standing in this very formal way with this wall behind him, this sort of architecture that you can see that sort of enhances the sense of dignity. The one on the right is Jan Vos, who is a poet and playwright, and much more free in this pose and the handling and the kind of use of the chalk. I mean, and these were done within a year of each other. But he can respond so incredibly to the wishes, desires, the character of the sitters in his portraits. And this is true as well with his painted portraits. This, in fact, is Jan Lievens in Amsterdam. At the time, he's painting for the town hall. That painting that we saw with the Brunio and on the shield. This is a portrait he paints of the Earl of Ancram, who is another crotchety old guy. This is not the crotchety old guy we saw earlier. This is a crotchety old English aristocrat. And you can tell, if you saw those two paintings together, how different their skin qualities are, and their wrinkles are different. I mean, an English aristocrat and a Dutch guy are very different in the way they age, apparently. But he is how different. I mean, these were painted within a year of each other. Again, you know, Lievens showing himself as a new Van Dyck, as it were, in his pose, kind of like the Jan Vos pose. Ancram, he was a difficult person for sure, but he found that Lievens was even more difficult. He said Lievens thinks more highly of himself than any other artist in all of the Northern Europe. I mean, so Lievens had an enormously powerful sense of self. He was never a shy violet. And this, we go back to the story of, you know, our perception of the artist as follower of Rembrandt. He was never a follower. He was not a follower type. He was always bold and expressive and pushing himself forward in every possible way, all the way through. He met every challenge. He pushed himself in new situations to discover what made art work, how to sell paintings, how to sell prints, how to sell drawings. He was very aggressive with this. Part of that, and that's a characteristic that Hawkins also noted, that he should take more advice. He should be a little bit more humble. He was probably his own worst enemy in lots of ways, because he had a lot of complicated relationships over the years that maybe encouraged him to move a lot. He was unlike Rembrandt, who stayed in his own house all these years. Lievens was always moving from The Hague to Amsterdam to Berlin to back and forth to Leiden, all over the place. And part of that was because he was searching commissions and getting commissions and moving around. But part of it, I think, was he just did not have many friends. And he was a difficult person. So the whole story is to me, is a really fascinating. Why did he get so forgotten? You know, what is it about Lievens, who was so powerful, so well known, so highly regarded, getting all these commissions that Rembrandt wanted, that at a certain point in time, it just disappears? And to a certain extent, it is all, I mean, it's partly Lievens' fault, as I'm trying to say a little bit, but a lot of it is the result of the 19th century. There was this Rembrandt mania that developed in the 19th century. At the time of the sense of the artist as genius, the isolated artist as genius, Rembrandt rises up to that level in the 19th century perception of artists. And everybody around Rembrandt becomes lesser as a result. Rembrandt becomes greater because, in fact, a lot of paintings that other artists painted, their best paintings, become Rembrandts. And the other artists, because those paintings are no longer part of their work, become lesser as a result. So you have the great Rembrandts, for sure. I'm not trying to take anything away from Rembrandt, but it's interesting that historically how the story kind of spirals. It spirals out of control. So you watch Rembrandt's, the number of works attributed to Rembrandt, they keep rising and rising and rising all through the 19th century. And he becomes more and more important. Everybody else becomes less and less important. The great paintings that Lievens had done get dismissed. They said, well, they're not as good because they're not Rembrandt, or they become Rembrandts. It's really interesting. So it's only in the 20th century, after Hawkins' story was told, it was an autobiography that was never published to the end of the 19th century, that story starts getting told. And then slowly through the 20th century, you see people looking again. I'm trying to understand. A lot of this comes out of Germany. But I must say, this exhibition, I felt, really told that story, brought all the different aspects of his career together, so you could see it finally. You could see that Lievens looks like one artist, looks like a Utrecht artist at a certain point, like a Rembrandt artist at some time, like a Van Dyck at some time, and like somebody else sometime. But you could see it happen. it was very exciting. It was very exciting, and I hope some of you had a chance to see it. And if not, there's I think nice catalog that tells that story as well. But I hope when you go to Philadelphia or the gallery or the Getty or the Rijksmuseum or wherever you happen to travel and see these works, or in the print room of the Met or the Pierpont Morgan, you spend some time with these works. They are really incredibly powerful, gifted works that make you think about yourself and the world about you in wonderful new ways. Thank you very much.